There is a kind of man who does not argue with a government he disagrees with. He loads a rifle and walks into the mountains. And in the summer of 1793, that man had a name, or rather, he had 15 of them. 15 surnames that showed up again and again on the muster rolls of the Western Pennsylvania Rebellion that would become the first true test of the federal government's authority over its own citizens. The men who carried those names did not think of themselves as rebels. They thought of themselves as people who had already paid once in blood to be free of a distant government telling them what they could do with the grain they grew on land they had cleared themselves. The whiskey tax that Congress passed in 1791 felt to them like a second British crown, and they said so, loudly, with weapons in hand. What happened to those families afterward is the part the history books skip. The rebellion was put down. Washington rode out personally, the only sitting president to lead troops in the field on American soil. Pardons were issued. The men went home, and then, quietly, methodically, they vanished from the Pennsylvania records and reappeared somewhere else. The migration that followed was not random. It followed the same corridors those families had already used to get to Pennsylvania in the first place, down through Virginia, into the Tennessee and Kentucky hills, deeper into what the official surveys still marked as frontier. The surnames traveled with them, and the DNA traveled with those surnames. What the genetic record now shows, when you run the descendant clusters through the consumer testing databases, is that the families who carried these 15 names share a genetic signature tight enough to map the founder effect of a people who moved together, settled together, and stayed together for the better part of 2 centuries after the Federal Army came over the ridge. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. To understand why these particular surnames matter, you have to understand what kind of people were living in western Pennsylvania in 1793 and where they had come from before that. The Monongahela country, the river valleys and wooded ridges west of the Allegheny Mountains, was not English territory in any meaningful cultural sense by the time of the rebellion. The English settlers had taken the coastline and the good tidewater farmland. The people who pushed past the mountains were mostly Scots-Irish, descendants of the Scottish border families who had been planted in Ulster by King James in the early 1600s, who had lived there for a century under rack-renting landlords and discriminatory religious laws, and who had then crossed the Atlantic in 5 great waves between 1717 and the American Revolution. They came looking for land that no one could take from them. They found the frontier. They built log cabins in hollows that the surveyors had not yet named. They raised corn and rye, and they distilled that grain into whiskey because whiskey was easier to carry over mountain trails than bulk grain, and because, out in the western counties, whiskey was currency. A man paid his debts in whiskey. He settled accounts at the store in whiskey. He salted away his surplus in whiskey. When Alexander Hamilton pushed the whiskey excise through Congress in 1791 as a way to fund the new nation's war debt, he was not taxing a luxury. He was taxing the medium of exchange of an entire economy, and he was doing it at the point of production, meaning the small distiller paid the tax while the large eastern distiller could spread the cost across volume. The men in the western counties understood the math immediately. They had seen this kind of policy before in Ulster, and they knew what it meant about who the government thought they were. The surnames that appear most consistently in the records of the rebellion are the same surnames that dominate the Ulster migration rolls from the decades before. McFarlane appears in the tax resistance petitions of 1792 and again in the muster lists of the Mingo Creek Democratic Society, the radical association that became the organizational spine of the resistance. Miller shows alongside it in the deposition records taken after the burning of the excise inspector's house at Bower Hill in July of 1794, a name so common in the Pennsylvania German counties that its appearance in the Scots-Irish rebellion records is easily overlooked, but is confirmed by the church membership rolls of the Presbyterian congregations that provided the social architecture of the resistance. Hamilton appears in multiple forms across the western Pennsylvania census entries of the period, held by families whose paper trail runs back through Cumberland County and then back further to County Antrim and County Armagh. The irony that Hamilton was a Scots-Irish surname in the rebellion against Alexander Hamilton's excise policy did not go unremarked at the time. The men who noted it were not laughing. Crawford is in the record. Patterson is in the record, a name so common in the Ulster emigrant stream that its frequency in any given county's tax list is itself a reliable indicator of Scots-Irish settlement density. The Crawford families, who appear in the Washington County Resistance Papers, show a migration pattern before 1794 that tracks the Great Wagon Road south from Philadelphia through Lancaster and then west into the mountains, which is the standard Scots-Irish route into the frontier counties. After the rebellion, a Crawford household appears in the Harrison County, Virginia deed book in 1797. Whether that entry represents a family that left Pennsylvania in the aftermath of the federal military deployment is a question the paper trail cannot settle absolutely, but the timing places it within the window of the post-rebellion migration, and the direction is consistent with the broader movement the other surnames show. Mitchell appears in the deposition records in the voices of men who attended the armed meetings at Couché's Fort in the summer of 1794, when the resistance was organizing itself into something that looked, briefly, like it might become a second revolution. Stewart is alongside it. Stewart is a surname that carries its own history of border service. The stewards of the Scottish royal household becoming a clan, and then a dynasty, and then, through the Ulster migration, a set of farming families in the western Pennsylvania hills who remembered the name's weight without necessarily knowing its origin. Several Stewart households appear in the Mingo Creek area in the 1790 census, and are absent from the 1798 direct tax, the standard genealogical indicator of a family that departed the county in the intervening years. The 1798 direct tax was itself a cause of resentment, a fact-finding mission by the federal government that many of the Western families viewed as the excise policy's cousin, and some of the departures it documents may represent families that left in the years immediately following the rebellion, rather than in the rebellion's immediate aftermath. Wilson shows in the land grant records in a way that rewards careful reading. Several Wilson families who appear in Washington County, Pennsylvania in 1792 do not appear in the 1798 direct tax, meaning they had left. The question the genealogical record asks, but cannot always answer, is where they went, and the DNA evidence now gives at least a partial reply. The consumer testing companies that have mapped their user bases against historical migration corridors have identified a cluster they label variously as Western Pennsylvania Scots-Irish and Appalachian British Isles that shows unusually tight internal relatedness for a population spread across several states. Wilson families who test today and whose paper trail runs through the western Pennsylvania counties in this period appear within that cluster at a rate that exceeds what random migration would predict, which is consistent with a community that moved in parallel rather than as isolated households. Anderson presents a particular case worth examining at length. The Andersons who appear in the Washington County Resistance were not a single family but a surname cluster, multiple unrelated or distantly related households sharing the name, as was common in communities of dense Scots-Irish settlement where the same surname pool had been circulating for generations in a geographically bounded area. The Y-chromosome evidence from descendant surname projects shows that the Andersons of the Monongahela country do not all trace to a single male ancestor, which is exactly what you would expect from this kind of cluster formation. They shared a name and a culture and a set of grievances, and they shared a migration pattern afterward. After 1794, Anderson households appear with higher frequency in the land grant records of Kentucky and Tennessee than you would predict from normal westward migration rates. The cluster moved together, or in parallel, and that is the genetic signature of a community relocating rather than individuals drifting. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. Roberts carries a different kind of complexity. Roberts is a Welsh surname at its root, son of Robert, brought into Wales and then into the English border counties over centuries of movement, and it appears in the Ulster migration stream not primarily through Scottish settlement, but through a smaller current of Welsh nonconformists who crossed to Ulster in the 1600s for reasons parallel to, but distinct from, the Scottish Presbyterian migration. By the time the Roberts families appear in western Pennsylvania, that Welsh origin was buried under 2 or 3 Ulster generations and was not something anyone was likely to record or discuss. What the census entries show is Welsh in surname, Presbyterian in religion, and Scots-Irish in behavior and migration pattern, which is how the Ulster stream absorbed people from the edges of the British world and carried them west as part of a single cultural current that the official categories could not contain. A Roberts family that traces its Pennsylvania origins to the 1780s and shows a westward departure after 1794 is most likely not Welsh in any cultural sense that anyone in that household would have recognized. They were Scots-Irish in the only terms that mattered on the frontier, in their faith, their land hunger, and their conviction that the government owed them less than it was asking. Faulkner shows a similar layering. Faulkner is an occupational surname from the English falconry tradition, the man who kept and trained hawks, and it moved into Scotland and then into Ulster through channels that genealogical records can trace only approximately. The Faulkners of western Pennsylvania in 1794 are Presbyterian and Scots-Irish, in cultural terms, even if the surname origin points somewhere else entirely. Several Faulkner men appear in the deposition records taken by the Federal Commission investigating the rebellion, not as leaders but as participants, present at armed meetings and gatherings, the ordinary weight of a community making a collective decision that the records caught only partially. After the rebellion, a Faulkner family appears in the land records of Bourbon County, Kentucky in 1797. Whether they are the same family is a question the paper trail cannot settle conclusively, but the timing and the direction are consistent with the pattern the other surnames show. The gap between the western Pennsylvania record and the Kentucky record is the gap where the migration happened, and many of these families left no documentation of the crossing itself because crossing the mountains on foot or by wagon was not the kind of event that produced official paperwork. Burns requires a word about what happens to surnames at borders. Burns in its Scottish form is a place name, the man who lived near the burn, the stream, and it appears in Ulster records in multiple variant spellings, some of which are anglicizations of the Irish name Burn, which sounds similar in spoken form but has an entirely different Gaelic origin. By the time Burns families appear in western Pennsylvania, the question of whether a given household descends from a Scottish Burns or an Irish Burn whose name was anglicized at the point of entry into the Protestant legal world of Ulster is often impossible to determine from the paper record alone. The Y-chromosome evidence from the Burns Surname Project shows both lineages present in the Appalachian descendant population, which means the migration stream carried both, and that the name in any given family tree is not a reliable guide to which ancestry a DNA test will return. This is the kind of specificity the census cannot provide, and the genome can. If your name is Burns and your family was in the western Pennsylvania or Virginia or Tennessee records in the early 1800s, the Y chromosome test will tell you which side of that Ulster divide you actually descend from. Moore is one of the most common surnames in the entire Scots-Irish migration record, common enough that its presence in any given county's tax list proves very little on its own. But the Moore families who appear in the Washington County resistance petitions and then vanish from the subsequent tax records show the same timing and directional pattern as the other names in this group. Several Moore households reappear in the Harrison County, Virginia records in 1797 and 1798, placing them in the corridor that would carry the next generation south into Tennessee and Kentucky. The Moore name, like Patterson and Wilson, is so widely distributed in the Scots-Irish descendant population that the surname alone is insufficient to establish a connection to the rebellion families. What the genealogical record requires is the specific county, the specific tax year, the specific church membership record that places a household in western Pennsylvania before 1794 and somewhere south or west of it after. The surname is the door, as it always is in this kind of research. The church register and the county deed book are the house. The last name on this list that demands careful attention is McConnell. It is a Mac patronymic, son of Domhnall, the same Gaelic personal name that gives us Donald, and it appears in both Scottish and Irish forms across the Ulster records, the spelling variation tracking the geographic and cultural origin of the specific family rather than any consistent anglicization policy. The McConnells of western Pennsylvania in the rebellion period are multiple households with no demonstrated common ancestor but with overlapping social networks. They appear in the same church records, the same land transaction witness lists, the same petition signatories. After 1794, McConnell households appear in the Knoxville Gazette land sale notices and in the Greene County, Tennessee deed books. The migration was real. The timing matches the rebellion. What the DNA evidence adds, for families who have tested through the McConnell Surname Project, is confirmation that at least some branches of this name in the southern mountains carry the same Y chromosome signature as the Ulster-McConnell clusters, the founder effect holding across 230 years and 3 or 4 migrations. Brackenridge requires a note of its own, though the name appears in the rebellion record in a different register than the others. Hugh Henry Brackenridge was the most educated man in Pittsburgh in 1794 and one of the few prominent citizens who tried to mediate between the rebels and the federal commissioners. He was a lawyer, a novelist, a former chaplain in the Continental Army, and a man whose Ulster Presbyterian background gave him a complicated sympathy for the people burning excise offices while simultaneously understanding that the rebellion could not succeed. His account of the period, published as an apology and a history simultaneously, is one of the few primary sources that names names and describes motivations without the filter of a federal report justifying a military deployment. Brackenridge was Scottish by origin, his family having come through Ulster in the same stream as everyone else around him. His name appears in the records under multiple spellings, Brackenridge, Breckenridge, Brackenridge, because the clerks who wrote it down heard it spoken with accents that were part Scots, part Ulster, and part whatever Pennsylvania German or English inflection had crept in from neighboring settlements. The Breckenridge families who later appear in Kentucky political history, including John C. Breckenridge, who served as vice president under James Buchanan and later as a Confederate general, carry that same Ulster surname through the same southern migration corridor. The spelling diverged, the origin did not. The document that comes closest to capturing what these 15 families thought of themselves is not a federal deposition or a county land record. It is a petition submitted to the Pennsylvania state legislature in 1792, before the rebellion turned violent, signed by several hundred men from the western counties asking that the excise be repealed. The language of the petition is measured and Presbyterian in its construction, careful, biblically inflected, and absolutely certain of its moral ground. The men who signed it did not think they were asking for a favor. They thought they were stating a right. That is the border mentality carried intact across 2 oceans and a mountain range. The belief that a man's labor and the products of his land belonged to him, and that a government which had not cleared the ground or planted the seed had no claim on what the harvest produced. It is the same belief that had made the border reivers take back by night what the English army had taken by day 3 centuries earlier. The surnames were different. The ground was different. The conviction was identical. What the rebellion ultimately showed about these 15 surnames is not that the men who carried them were criminals, though the federal government briefly treated them as both criminals and traitors. It showed that they were the same people who had always moved when the law became intolerable. Who had left Scotland for Ulster when the border became ungovernable? Who had left Ulster for Pennsylvania when the rents and the religious laws became unbearable? Who had left the Pennsylvania coast for the western counties when the good land was already claimed? And who left the western counties for the mountain south when the federal government sent 12,000 soldiers over the ridge to demonstrate who was in charge? The direction was always the same, away from authority, toward the edge, into the ground that nobody else wanted yet. The genetic signature of that movement is still readable in the descendant population today. The consumer testing companies that have mapped their user bases against historical migration corridors have identified a cluster that shows unusually tight internal relatedness for a population spread across several states. The founder effect of a community that moves together and stays together is visible in the long shared DNA segments that cousins who have never met return when their results are compared. If your family carries one of these 15 surnames and your people were in western Pennsylvania before 1800, the test will very likely return a result that places you in that cluster, not because the algorithm knows about the Whiskey Rebellion, but because the people who carried these names after 1794 were, in genetic terms, each other's cousins, and 2 centuries of mountain settlement did not dilute that signal the way coastal mixing would have. The mountains kept what the mountains were given. The county courthouse records that survived from western Pennsylvania between 1790 and 1800 are incomplete. Some of the families who were present at the burning of Bower Hill in July of 1794 left no paper record of their presence there because no one wrote their names down at the time, or because the records that contained their names did not survive the following decades, or because they left the county before the federal commission arrived to take depositions. Their descendants carry the genetic evidence of the migration that followed without always carrying the documentary evidence of why it happened. Family Search holds the surviving land records, tax lists, church registers, and deed books for Washington and Westmoreland and Fayette counties in the relevant years. A Y-DNA test through the Relevant Surname Project can confirm whether a male line ancestor places within the expected cluster for this region and period. The paper trail leads to the rebellion. The DNA confirms the family was there. Together they tell a story that neither source can tell alone, and the story they tell is older than the republic that sent the army to end it. The 15 surnames did not survive the rebellion as a monument or a legacy anyone claimed openly. They survived because the people who carried them loaded their wagons and crossed the next ridge and built another set of log cabins in another hollow, and kept the names alive in the ordinary way, by giving them to their children, who gave them to their children, who gave them to you. The federal government that sent the army in 1794 won the argument about who held authority over the western counties, but the families won the distance, and the distance for people whose entire cultural logic was built around the proposition that the best answer to an intolerable law is a new piece of ground, was always the point. The genome does not require the family to remember what the family did. It only requires that the family stayed close enough, for long enough, for the shared DNA to accumulate into something a test can read 230 years later. And in these 15 names, it did. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story. There is one more layer to this story that the tax records and deposition rolls cannot fully capture, and that is the role the Presbyterian Church played as the institutional spine of the rebellion and of the migration that followed it. The Scots-Irish who settled western Pennsylvania were not loosely organized bands of individual homesteaders. They were congregations. They had been congregations in Ulster, gathering in meeting houses that the Test Act tried to close to them, and they organized themselves the same way in the Monongahela country. The church elder lists and session records for the Presbyterian congregations of Washington County in the 1780s and 1790s are among the most reliable genealogical documents for this population because they tracked membership with a consistency that the civil records did not always match. Several of the 15 surnames appear in these session records in the years leading up to the rebellion, and their absence from the records after 1794 is sometimes the only indicator that a family departed. A man who stops appearing in the session minutes and does not appear in the next county census has almost certainly moved, and the direction, given the post-rebellion pattern, is south and west with a high degree of probability. The role of the Mingo Creek Association is worth understanding in that same context. The Mingo Creek Democratic Society was formally organized in 1793 in Washington County, and its membership overlapped substantially with the membership of the local Presbyterian congregations. This was not coincidental. The political theology of Ulster Presbyterianism held that a congregation had not just the right but the obligation to resist unjust authority, a position rooted in the Scottish Covenanters of the 1600s who had gone to war with the Stuart kings over exactly this question. The men of the Mingo Creek Association were not inventing a political philosophy in the Pennsylvania hills. They were applying one they had inherited, that had been worked out in blood on Scottish hillsides 150 years before, and carried to Ulster and then across the Atlantic in the cultural memory of a people who did not forget what they had paid for their convictions. The surname McFarlane, which heads this list, is worth a longer look for the same reason. The McFarlanes of the Western Pennsylvania records carry a clan name that originated in the Lennox district of Scotland on the western shore of Loch Lomond. They were not a border family in the River tradition but Highland adjacent, and their movement into Ulster was part of the broader Scottish plantation that pulled from multiple regions of Scotland rather than exclusively from the border counties. By the time the McFarlane families appear in Pennsylvania, that Highland origin was 2 or 3 generations removed and was not reflected in their cultural behavior, which was thoroughly Scots-Irish Presbyterian in every documented respect. Their appearance in the rebellion records places them in the same current as the border surnames around them, which is the Ulster stream absorbing its various tributaries and moving them together as a single population through American history. The question of what a surname proves and what it only suggests runs through all of this research. A surname proves nothing on its own about a specific individual's ancestry. The same name was held by unrelated families who happened to share it, by families whose name was anglicized at the point of immigration from a Gaelic original that bore no phonetic resemblance to the English form it became. What a surname does, when it appears consistently in a specific county at a specific period and then disappears from that county and reappears in a consistent direction, is create a hypothesis that the documentary and genetic evidence can then test. The 15 names in this video create that hypothesis for the Western Pennsylvania post-rebellion migration. The church records, the deed books, the tax lists, and the Y-DNA results are the evidence that tests it. None of those sources, taken alone, is sufficient. Taken together, they build a case that has more weight than any single document could carry. By 1820, the surnames in this list had spread from Kentucky to Tennessee to Ohio to Indiana, following the land grants and the river corridors and the mountain gaps that the long hunters had mapped in the generation before. By 1850, They were across the Mississippi. The genetic trail they left is readable at each step, because at each step the population stayed close enough to itself to preserve the founder effect that the original Scots-Irish migration had established in the Pennsylvania hills. 200 years of westward movement did not erase the signal. The mountains and the hollows where they stopped longest concentrated it, and the consumer genetic databases that now hold millions of tested individuals can find it, in the shared segments that distant cousins carry without knowing they carry them, in the cluster labels that appear on a results page next to a percentage nobody quite expected. Your name may be in this list. If it is, and if your paper trail runs through the western Pennsylvania counties in the decade before or after 1794, what you are looking at is not just a surname. It is the genetic and documentary residue of a decision that a community of Scots-Irish farming families made when the Federal Army came over the ridge to load the wagons and go deeper into the country that the government had not yet reached. They went, they stayed. The DNA stayed with them, and it is still there, waiting in the results page of a test you can order today, carrying the weight of a rebellion that the history book summarized in a paragraph and the genome recorded in full.